Hello, welcome. Yeah, we are happy to present. We is Bring Your Own Book and Roma Publications. Jordi, Susu, Augustinas. Jordi is also Roma, actually. Yeah, we found out that David Senior was in town also to visit the exhibition of Karel Martens and to be with David Dryfoot for a lecture yesterday, I think, before. And we thought it's a great opportunity to invite you for a talk. I knew David from many years, New York Art Book Fair and Printed Matter Book Fair in LA, where he always hosted similar kind of talks, 1 hour talks, all day long, all fair long, for many years in the classroom. And yeah, he was the librarian of the MoMA Library, yeah. And always coming at the fair, picking up books, yeah, which is a good basis to become friends. And now, after working at the MoMA for around 15 years, he moved to San Francisco and became librarian of the San Francisco Modern Museum of Museum of Modern Art. And you quit you were retired from the classroom cyclus. Yeah. So now we are happy to hear you talk, and I hand over the microphone to you.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you for the introduction and for welcoming me here. And it was also, I know that the Roma just published a book about the 40th anniversary of Boekie Woekie. And I think a lot about the history of artist books, and I thought I could present a talk that relates to sort of the 20th century history of artist publications that frames around an exhibition that happened in 1981 in New York, organized by an alternative space called Franklin Furnace, and it was called The Page as Alternative Space. The Page as Alternative Space was a 4-part exhibition series where they showed books from the historical avant-garde, sort of mid-century, and then the most contemporary books, which at that time was the 1970s and 80s. But this is also in the context of a show that I did at MoMA for their 40th anniversary. The Franklin Furnace Archive was founded in New York in 1976, and this is part of the exhibition and the founder, Martha Wilson. And at the MoMA in New York in 1976, there were all these alternative spaces popping up for performance and new art practices, but then simultaneously, there were these spaces for artist books and distribution and sales. And it happened that Franklin Furnace was an archive of artist books, like a self-run, artist-run archive. And that collection came into the MoMA Library collection in the 1990s. So I was the steward of that collection for a while and learned a lot from it. So this is an exhibition that we did, but this is Franklin Furnace as it was in the 1970s, where it was really focused on performance, but also artist books, and blended two things together quite seamlessly, because often artist books were documenting performance, and there were also performances with books and publishing. But we'll get into the exhibition, and then my talk will just give examples sort of through my lens of like each period that this exhibition represented. So I'm using this exhibition as a framing device for this talk. So the examples I'll give from each time period weren't necessarily, or some were in this show, but some are just more things I'm thinking about right now, or things that intersected with my own practice of making exhibitions with books in the last 20 years. But this first section was curated by Clive Philpott, who was a librarian at MoMA, but also was a thinker of artist books. Clive often made interesting diagrams to try to define what artist books were. This was one that he made in the early 1980s, around the time that this show happened. And he did this exhibition on the historical avant-garde. And here's some, I love the way this show looks. It was sort of wild. This is the section of the 1940s and 50s. And Barbara Moore and John Hendricks did the 50s to 69 in this exhibition. Barbara Moore made an essay for the Boekie Woekie book. And John Hendricks was an important mentor of mine. He was a curator of Fluxus materials primarily, and is the recognized sort of knows the most about that field of experimental publishing from the 60s. And I learned a lot from him as we worked together in New York. These are just some more slides. This is the 70s and 80s period, which was more like punk inflected. And this was a lecture series. So this lecture would be sort of way down at the bottom, follow up on these lectures that happened in 1981 in New York. So you can get the sense of what they were thinking about in this project. So that was an introduction, and this is my take on this framing of the page as alternative space. So we'll start with the earliest stuff, and this is Francesco Congiulo, Cafe Concerto. So there was futurist books in this exhibition, and this is one of my favorites that examines sort of a playful use of text as one of the things. As a theme through this will be the way artists and designers have used already existing forms of sort of print culture, in this case the playbill or the concert program, to make something completely different. And this one, he makes all of the performers and the dancers out of type. So it's an explosion of language in a really playful way. I like these details. So each example that I'll give, I'll go fairly quickly. And the lecture here is not meant to go too deep in any one thing, but just give you paths to follow maybe later. And I'm happy to share this presentation if anyone wants it later. These are things I think about all the time. These little butterflies that the Surrealists made in 1925. They were handed out on the street in front of the Bureau of the Surrealist office. And it had just nonsense poems or little colloquial sayings like, parents, tell your children your dreams, or if you love love, you'll love surrealism. And these are called butterflies because they were meant to go around the city. They were meant to flutter and wind up anywhere by chance. And I love that idea. And this last section about the historical avant-garde, for my section of the page as alternative space, is about a show that I did in 2016 about constructivist magazines from the 1920s, mostly in Eastern and Central Europe, and showed how the sort of mark of like El Lissitzky as a magazine maker and Kurt Schwitters and others that were interested in new typography use the magazine as a productive space for this new work to travel. I really got into the details of a lot of these magazines where they were creating new forms of type just by creatively using the furniture around the print shop to create these forms, and scanning a lot of these examples as part of a slideshow that happened in the exhibition. I like to see where the registration leaves spaces. It doesn't quite match up, showing sort of how it was an experiment at printing. And some are just nice, like this. There's a lot of manicules. We have this like pointing to the square as like this didactic device, and just like learning how to make letters with these new, in this new way. The other element from this that I really take away is often in the back of each of these magazines, there will be a list of other magazines. So built into the publication is this network, communication network idea that you could learn about these sort of like comrades that were making other kinds of movement magazines around the world. This is Block, which was a wonderful magazine from Warsaw in the 1920s. Ma was Leos Kasak, a Hungarian artist that wound up in Vienna in the 20s and made Ma, which was Today in Hungarian. A lot of these magazines had these invented words that tried to describe the image making that the artists were using. Kasak developed this idea in German, Bildarchitektur, that he was publishing examples of with his own work. This is his prints in Ma. This is the same idea in Ma, where all the lists of magazines are at the back. This is also an example of why you shouldn't bring a pen into a library. This is the last one of this section. This is 75 HP. That was the amount of horsepower in the early cars from the 1920s that were around. So there was this allusion to the sort of new industry and new machines that these artists were reflecting on. And this was from Bucharest. Their language that they were trying to create, Victor Bronner was the main guy behind this. It was pictopoesy, like a picture poetry. And this is a layout from one. I have a soft spot for one-issue magazines, like ones that just happen once and don't happen again. This was a one-issue wonder. This is a great detail from that. This is one that I always show to students in classes. I should say, with some of these too, I also am working a lot with classes of students that come to the library where I work, and this talk sort of mirrors to some of the classes that I have where I bring out these books for people to look through. Abeceda is designed by Karel Taiga, who is a Czech designer. And it's, again, appropriating an existing form, one of the oldest forms of books, the like ABC book in terms of children's books. But it was a surrealist poem by Vítězslav Nezval, who interpreted the alphabet in this poem. And then it was complemented by a dance performance by this woman, Milsa Majerova. It took place in reality in Prague in this same year, but then it was reproduced in these pages. And each spread has the poetry, the interpretation of the letter by Karel Taiga, and then the dancer. So this is a real intermedia presentation, and I love it so much. H is very strong. K is jazzy. W is sort of like the shrug emoji. So that was the historical avant-garde, like the 1920s, and this is for me something that I never quite leave in terms of thinking about this idea of communication through these magazines as essential to the aesthetic ideas that were coming all across Europe to North America to Asia to South America. The magazine was the carrier of this stuff. It was in the mail. We're going into the 1950s. This is a work by Marcel Duchamp that's in the library collection where I work. It's a piece of trash. And I discovered this. It wasn't cataloged as, it was cataloged as this flat poster in the library, and it was stuffed in a box. And when I first arrived at the library at SFMOMA, I opened it up, and this came out. It was sort of like that sort of prank where like snakes come out of a can. But this came out, and I didn't know what it was. But the story is that Duchamp developed a really rigorous catalog and designed it himself of all of the activities of the Dada movement for a gallery called the Sidney Janis Gallery in 1953 in New York. And he created it. It's a letterpress poster with this other silkscreen on top. And then when he was presenting it to the gallery, he was like, wait. And he had a portion of them put aside and asked them to crumple, because he was also being asked to produce a work for this exhibition that he also curated. But he had them crumple up a bunch of the posters and litter it around the gallery and then fill up a wastebasket with them. And then some were sent out in the mail like this as a crumpled piece of trash. And not a lot survived because people received it as a crumpled piece of trash. From what I can tell in museums, there's only one other copy that looks like that in the world at the Philadelphia Museum of Art that has a big Duchamp collection. So I'm quite proud of this, and we just got a new pedestal for it in the library, which I'm also proud of. But I always show it, and it's behind the desk, like the reference desk at the library, and it's shown with the flat one and then the crumpled version. So this is in the framing of the original show from the sort of 1950s to the 69 period. And this is a book that's in the MoMA Library called Pika Book of the Week. This is a scan of the cover and each opening and the back cover from a promotional booklet that the artist Ray Johnson made. He was a young designer. He became known for his mail art practices, like correspondence art in the 60s and 70s. But when he arrived in New York, he was creating a lot of work as a way to get magazines and art directors at magazines to learn about his design and illustration work. So these were like promotional booklets for Ray Johnson designs that are quite rare, but also he got work like with Harper's Weekly, and he did book covers for New Directions in this time period. Andy Warhol has similar early books where they were like promotional, they're self-published, and were sent to art directors as a way to get people's attention, mostly for their hand lettering and that kind of illustration work. But these are some of my favorite examples of that time period of Ray Johnson things. I did a show at MoMA called Ray Johnson Designs, if anybody's interested in that kind of thing. The website's still up, and it has a lot of these promotional flyers that he made, as well as books. This is Semina. So Roher said that I wound up in San Francisco. So some of this stuff that we're heading into will have more of a California feel because it has to do with stuff, not just in the collection where I work, but sort of getting at things that I'm working on acquiring and adding to the collection to tell the story of print in art in the place where I now live. Wallace Berman was originally from Los Angeles, or working in Los Angeles, and he had a show at a gallery called the Ferris Gallery in the late 1950s, and it was closed by the police because there was content in it that was deemed indecent, or decency laws in the States that you couldn't show things in public. It was a sex thing. In this show, there was somebody having sex in a drawing, and that he spent a night in jail because of this, and it resulted in Semina, which was how he made work after that, because he didn't want to have that same kind of public practice in galleries because of he wanted to do whatever he wanted to do. He didn't want to go around those sort of decency laws. So SFMOMA was designed like this, where each cover had a picture on it, but the folder was sort of like a mail packet. So it always had a container. So this is issue 7 of SFMOMA, and then you opened it, and this this pocket would be in there. And you can see he was living outside of San Francisco at the time in Larkspur, and this is from 1961. All of the printed elements are letterpress printed. They're a very small number of copies, and they were just sent to friends, colleagues. It wasn't something he sold. It was sort of a network he created through this magazine in the mail. This is that same issue sort of exploded. And it was very much a mixture of poetry and text. And it was like an exhibition in a mailer. But very small, and a lot of photography, but there was also reproduced drawings and other kinds of collage. This is the copy in SFMOMA's library. On the top, it has an inscription by him where he's thanking somebody for the use of his darkroom. I haven't figured out whose darkroom it was. How we doing? Everybody okay? We're going quick. We're in the 1960s, so we'll go to the 1980s. This is the goal. We'll get to the 1980s, but we're in the 60s now. These are two of my. I did a lot of research into art and design practices in the 1950s and 60s in the former Yugoslavia, and these are two examples of magazines. One from a group called Gorgona in 1961. This is a meander. A lot of these are reproduced of the artist's work that were in the collective. This meander was a guy named Julie Kniefer, who was living in Zagreb and was part of this group. And then the bottom one is a magazine called A by Ivan Spitsil, who was a little bit older than the Gorgona group. He was in a collective called Exet 51, who were making architecture and design. Vanislav Richter was another member of this group. But Pacil was around Gorgona too. They were all working together. A by Pacil. Pacil was like the house designer for like the New Tendencies group in the 60s in Yugoslavia. That was like a series of shows showing new art and design. He had made some very nice posters at the time. But it was like one small sheet that folded out and was one artist in the magazine. So each of these examples are just one issue of the magazine and often folded out maybe 4 or 5 times. This is an artist named Mangalos, who was, I forget his full name, but he was an art historian that became also a known artist. And then this is Vanislav Richter, these 2 issues of these. They really look good in the slide, right? They're good. The next few slides are from a show I curated for the 50th anniversary of a gallery in Warsaw called the Foxhall Gallery. And they were from the beginning, were very fixated on their archive or their gallery as also an archive of not only the practices that happened there, but also collecting things that were sent to them from around the world, quite specifically because of the political situation in Poland, where it was hard to get access to information about international art, or a little harder than you would like. And so they thought their archive would show new work, but also present sort of an information hub for art practices happening around the world. This is one of my favorite invitation cards. It's a flexi disc that plays a recording of being invited to the first gallery show of the Foxhall Gallery in 1966. And it has this very affected voice that I'm told, I don't understand Polish that well, I'm told took the form of like a news report, a very formal voice reciting like what was going to happen at the gallery opening. I've heard a recording of it, and it's great. But this was the beginning of the gallery. It was that invitation. But I'm showing this here because of another theme about books from this time, where they were often archives of sort of temporary or ephemeral and like site-specific art practices. In this case, the panoramic sea happening, which was Tadeusz Kantor was the artist involved, and he directed this artist, who is a painter named Edward Krasinski, to conduct the sea. And this is a beautiful image that is reproduced in this publication that the gallery made in 1967. It's a very long landscape book that had, and the format was conducive to showing a really nice shot of this performance. And so quite literally, this was produced for the community around them, but also was like a message in a bottle to be sent out to other colleagues in the art world in other places in Europe, just to let them know what was happening at the Vauxhall Gallery. Another activity that they had on the bottom was they were always theorizing about their archive and what it meant to have an archive. And in this case, the performance was to throw the archive into the sea. Sort of like how you have these artists that wanted to destroy all their old work, and like that was the plan. They performed like the destruction of their archive in this bottom performance. But it was kind of a gag. They didn't really destroy it. But this was the last example from the show that I'll present. And it was called the Living Archives Project. And they converted the gallery itself into a space to encounter publications from around the world. And it was very much in tune with things happening in contemporary art, where publications could be what Seth Siegelab called primary information. They weren't just secondary documents, but they could be the work. And recordings as well, and different kinds of like representations of performance work, scores, fluxus inflected things, but also conceptual art that was happening around the world. And that was the idea for this that happened for several months. And this is something we're thinking about, book spaces that we're opening in the next few years. This is a really early example of thinking about the book space as sort of a necessary element to think through and about contemporary art. That was an example of like performance and new kinds of art practices that were time-based being contained within publications. In this case, this is an example of sort of publishing as performance in a Daido Moriyama show in 1974. It was called The Printing Show, and he did it in Tokyo, where he had a gallery space where he would sit at a desk, and there was a early Xerox machine in the middle of the floor of the gallery, and then the back wall was hung many pictures that he took in a trip to New York. So people who attended the show could select pictures from the gallery walls, and he would take them and Xerox them and then assemble a book. And this is the screen print covers that he made for the book. And then the contents would be Xerox pictures of the gallery photography. Did I explain that well? Do you get it? So the book that you're seeing here is in the library collection where I work, and it was produced from like taking pictures from the wall and photocopying them in the gallery. So it was Moriyama performing sort of the act of assembling. He had those silkscreen covers sort of ready made, and then that would be what you took away the book from. But the actual book is called Another Country in New York, but the show was called The Printing Show, and that was from 1974. How we doing? Not bad. So we're still in the 60s and we're heading into the 70s. And this is in relation, more explicitly in relation to where the collection that I'm working with and building up in terms of posters that were politically engaged. In this case, and in my thinking, under the sign of Emory Douglas, who was the Minister of Culture, the designer for the Black Panther Party, who was based in San Francisco and still lives there now in the since the 1960s. But this show, Emory Douglas did a mural at the museum to the right, and then next to it was a show that I organized about sort of politically engaged poster making, historical and contemporary. But it was grounded with images from the Black Panther newspaper that Emory Douglas made in San Francisco in the 1960s. He went to a local community college to learn commercial printing, and there he learned how to make basic pay stubs to execute these kinds of drawings. In speaking with him, he was he stated very clearly that he understood people in his community weren't necessarily going to read the content of the newspapers, and that the graphics presented another way for people to access sort of the central tenets of the Black Panther Party. So he always thought of his graphics as like another way to reflect, to grab an audience, to learn about what they were trying to work towards in community building and advocacy work for changing laws and that kind of thing. But these are spreads from, so the newspaper you can see on the left picture on the right side that's the cover, but then the back of the newspaper would always have these graphics by Emory Douglas. He was using Letraset to create a lot of images, or just really basic ink drawing and paste up. So the most basic way to sort of make an image for production into a newspaper and doing it at a cheap cost was the way he went about it. And then there was also a lot of posters, and that was sort of a graphic style that was based out of necessity about the printing technology of the time, but became translated now into sort of like a language of protest that is often copied. And there's lots of examples from the last 60 years of like appropriating this style for other kinds of politically engaged illustration. This is another example from this exhibition and from this time period. And these are all silk screened on computer paper that was recycled from the University of California, Berkeley offices. So the students at the school went on strike in 1972 to protest the bombing of Cambodia and the killing of students in Kent State. So during the strike, people from this poster workshop made screens that laid out on one lawn, one area outside in a public space that people could make their own prints with the help of students who knew how to make prints. I go into a lot of houses of artists and designers who are of this generation, and everybody has these like in their collection. It's something that was very widespread, and a lot of people made them or collected them during the time and kept them. But for me, the interesting part is this engagement with the recycling of material of the office paper, and even just how it looks to have this data up against this sort of screen printed image. This is and the language was created by the people in this printmaking workshop, but often referencing like this. There was a group in New York called Up Against the Wall, Motherfucker, that this is like making reference to. But you have, I like taking pictures of the front and back. I found these in like a deep storage where I work, and it was during COVID, and no one knew where they came from, and they hadn't been cataloged ever before in the library, but there was many of them. So it was a really fun project during a time when things were pretty dark and closed down. The pictures are from like the storage. You can see the base. It's sort of like in a basement in the storage of like the floor around the pictures. But I don't know if it's nostalgia for this time period with like early computer printing for me, like why I'm drawn to this, but it's exciting in terms of not just being one thing, not just the print, but like this vestige of the early computer technology. This next section will be about sort of anarchist printing in San Francisco in the 1960s. And the Diggers were a group that were like a street, like guerrilla performance troupe in the Haight, sort of before the full-on hippie stuff happened. They were creating like language around sort of anti-capitalist, like free exchange of materials and labor and stuff like that. So they created this Digger dollar. And part of the group formed a like printing office called the Communication Company, and they were doing flyering around San Francisco, and it was always signed Communication Company, and these broadsides would have been handed out for free in public. These are like, I often connect these ones to like the Surrealist butterflies in terms of their intention of how they would have been distributed and circulated. They were just free, and you would have found them or tossed them or kept them. And out of the Digger movement became a lot of communal houses, like people were thinking about living collectively, and the Cauliflower House was one of the more well-known ones because they printed in the basement out of this free print shop that was established in 1969. And they were experimenting with like new kinds of gender and sexuality, sort of the sort of kernel of the gay liberation movement came from these in San Francisco, came from a lot of people that were engaging with these communal houses. But the Cauliflower, the magazine, it was hand stitched always like this, and it was just a bulletin board. It was meant as like an information service for people who were living in these collective houses in San Francisco and Oakland and other parts of the Bay Area. And so it was like a classified ads. For those in the back who can't see it, one of them says in the middle, "Gay orphan man needs family," and things, people looking for objects, people looking for ways to share information and activities. This is another issue from 1971. Someone left a small leather purse at the clown party. That was a good one. I am gay, a student, and tired of being alone. Would like to move in together into a together commune around or near. I can't read that part. So this is like this kind of information service that was being created by these people that were living in these spaces. But the distribution was like every Thursday they would take them around and be left for free in different shared housing places. So at the time, the circulation reached about, drop-offs were about at 300 different spaces around the Bay Area. But one of the things, the legacies of this Cauliflower House was a lot of the members of this drag performance group, the Coquettes, were originally living there. And the Coquettes were, I saw a documentary about them a while ago, and I remember John Waters stating very clearly that like the Coquettes were the beginning of the gay liberation movement in terms of their audacity and the way they perform their gender. But it all sort of coalesced around that Cauliflower publication and building. I've been collecting a lot of posters and flyers from their performances. this is the last example from this People's Printing show. And this is the Royal Chicano Air Force. And they were a group of Mexican-American artists that were creating posters and other publications for events around their community. Chicano is a word created during that time to represent sort of the Mexican-American community that was distinct from sort of Anglo-white culture that represented often indigenous traditions, indigenous meaning like sort of Native American symbols and traditions and colors and so creating a culture other than what the predominant culture was. So they were very active in terms of this this poster making in sort of representing their own culture in ways that they weren't finding in other places. They were based around Sacramento, which was a hub for like farming, and there was a lot of engagement with unionizing farm workers, as well as sort of just generally hosting community events. And it bled, they were from Sacramento, but it also, some of this stuff comes down into San Francisco in a gallery called Gallery de la Raza that was founded in this time in the 1970s. They were also making a lot of murals, so a lot of the murals like painting on walls in buildings, and a lot of the, it was either sort of this gesture of distributing posters or having these public art projects on walls. I've become really interested in this. At the time in San Francisco, there was a printing project where you could bring things to the this centralized printing house that was run by the city to make flyers. And they were making this, it was a stencil printer that they were able to produce a lot of interesting colors out of. And it's a sort of research project that I'm currently on, is just finding out more about this program and how they were making prints that look like this with like a mimeograph machine. All right, we're almost done. We're in like the 70s and this next part is about sort of media. And when I think about artist books too, in terms of this moment of like being able to say, what is an artist book? It's sort of about an intervention in sort of mass media. It's about sort of creating terms with publishing that allows to do it on your own, so do it yourself. But at this moment too, you have thinkers and writers that are really theorizing about media, what media is, and with video, with television, and with print media. So I group all of this kind of together in my head, sort of the onset of sort of experiments in sort of guerrilla television, experiments with video and video art practices, and then experiments with self-publishing. This is from a magazine called Radical Software, and this is another page from Radical Software. This is a page from the Whole Earth catalog that describes a book about publishing it yourself. And for me, when I talk to students and that kind of thing, it's important to impress how that was so uncommon, the ability to publish outside of a centralized media landscape. The tools with cheap offset and that kind of thing made it more possible to do things at volume that you could never do before, but also now too engaging with sort of media and media interventions, and thinking about what I mentioned earlier about the possibility of like appropriating another form that already exists in print culture, but making it yours. And these next examples are just like interventions in media that were being done by artists. This is one That was Jerry Shum was a gallerist that was part of the early video art movement and was based in, I think, Dusseldorf or Cologne. I'm not sure. But he had a commission with German television where he was injecting conceptual art performances into state television for like a few minutes every night. So this is a book, though, that reproduces the television performance of Keith Arnett. So that's why it's framed this way. And so if you turned on German television at like 7:30 one night, you would see this guy going down. But the book presents a way to proceed that's still cinematic, but takes a little bit longer, I think. I like to make him go back up. We could just keep doing this. The next one is a Dutch artist, Hans Eichelboom, called in the newspaper from 1978. I always like to include this one. It's super fun and also like a great project. He was living in Arnhem, I think, and he made the proposal to try to appear in the local newspaper for 10 consecutive days. And the artist's book reproduces pages from the newspaper where he appeared. And he's sort of like the hippie guy in the back, looking. So I don't know the full story. Maybe someone here does, about whether he knew somebody at the newspaper or something. But he would show up at parades, or this is some kind of like ribbon cutting or sports event. He's like lurking in the back. This is some local meeting where this is serious. Some bike accident. Okay. This is the last one of this series, and this is by Hal Fisher, who lived in San Francisco and was part of a conceptual photography movement in San Francisco that was quite heady. They were really, there were the translations of like French structuralist writers were happening in English for the first time. So they were reading Roland Barthes and Baudrillard and all these kinds of theories of the image that were exciting people. But he was also not interested in philosophy as much and sort of made fun of it in a way, but also made a project around the community of gay men that were living in the Castro district in 1978 and absorbing the language of like signifier and semiotics into this book called Gay Semiotics, a photographic study of visual coding among homosexual men. It's interesting, he had a show of this work that was closed because of its content. So it's similar like to the Semina, where it was something that could be in this book form in a better way, in a more free way than in a public space. But it's set up to be sort of looking like a philosophical or sociological text, but it's sort of in the language, you can kind of get the sense that he is making fun of it a little bit. And these existed as separate photographs with text combined with the book. The opportunity to have this spread, I think, makes it a better work. So yeah, this is almost the end. So we're going through this time period, and prior to this period in 1976, people didn't really know what to call these things that were experiments with publishing by artists. But people solidified around artist books and solidified around it enough for this magazine Art Right to have a special issue on artist books in 1976. And what they did is they asked artists just to explain why they made books. And it's a pretty concise way to get at sort of artist motivations around publishing that I really enjoy revisiting. This one by John Baldessari. Art seems pure for a moment and disconnected from money. And since a lot of people can own the book, nobody owns it. And Ulysses Carrion, who's attributed with being the director of other books and so in Amsterdam here. I hope with all my heart that finally, as usually happens, the amount of talent and production will surpass the amount of available capital. There will always remain a surplus of unsaleable beauty. It's a good one, Ulysses. And this last one is Lucy Lepard, who was part of sort of contemporary curating at this moment, but also was very engaged with the feminist art movement of the 1970s and curating around women's work. And she was interested in particular the way that artist books open up for women artists, a way for women artists to get their work out without depending on the undependable museum and gallery system. And they also serve as an inexpensive vehicle for feminist ideas. I'm talking about communication, but I guess I'm also talking about propaganda. So the last segment here, and we'll end, is for me the lasting. We started with Martha Wilson and Franklin Furness and her activity of organizing an artist book archive. And one of her intentions, not totally stated explicitly, was have a space where her friends' work could be collected in an archive. And her friends were artists from the feminist art movement. And she was creating a space for that didn't exist otherwise, for these things to be kept and housed. And from another coast in Los Angeles, the Feminist Studio Workshop was working explicitly through the work of Sheila de Bretteville, and the Feminist Studio Workshop was setting up training and emphasis on publishing and graphic arts. And for me, one of the strongest legacies of this moment in the 1970s in American contemporary art is the impact of the Feminist Studio Workshop and the feminist art movement in the East Coast and in the other direction, creating a space for feminist work in print. This is a poster that Sheila de Bretteville made for the opening of the Women's Building where the Feminist Studio Workshop was held. And they were encouraging artists in the program to make books and to make posters and to have public interventions with posters as part of the program, but they're also making interesting catalogs. This was a catalog designed called Woman House from 1972. I haven't figured out the red one, like which came first. I have a copy of the red one at work, but the top one is the one people know better. It was shaped as a house. And the project itself was each woman in the program had a room in the house that they installed art in. So the catalog goes through the house and shows all the different examples of the projects. Chrysalis was the magazine from the Women's Building that Sheila de Bretteville edited and designed. But this was one of the objects that I've come across in the past few years that I found particularly remarkable. It was from a show called Women and the Printing Arts from 1977 in the Women's Building. At this point, they had formed something called the Women's Graphics Center, and the show was held there. But the binder clip that the catalog was structured around was designed in a way that projects and women's projects that could be submitted and that it could expand. So it was meant to be like an open-ended publication that would keep adding different examples of artists that were working through the lens of feminism and the work that was being done at the Feminist Studio Workshop. I think graphically, it's really an interesting thing. Each each artist press gets one sheet in the front and back, shows the examples of projects. But this is the colophon from that. And this is just a nice picture of books made by Idel Appelbrug. And I'll end it there, and we can continue to look at this nice picture while we have a beer or something. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for coming, David, and thank you for your great talk. I just wanted to say maybe there's also space for questions if someone has it. Would you like to? Just otherwise, we just continue over beers. Also, yeah, and you can ask questions to David in person. Yeah. Also, the talk today ties in a little bit into a week of self-publishing and DIY publishing in Amsterdam after the Bring Your Own Book Fair, but also before the book launch of the Boekie Woekie book tomorrow at Boekie Woekie. Jan Vos, who is here, just had an exhibition in New York for Boekie Woekie, and there's a catalog, and come to the opening tomorrow from 4 at Boekie Woekie. We'll be there as well. And thank you again, David, for the talk. See you next time.